I don't know what we'll do.
We'll get by. We always do.
Here, take this. It's for the baby.
Oh, thank you. I can't thank you enough.
We're family.
A woman sold her own daughter like livestock, pregnant, shamed, and worth less than a horse in the eyes of her own blood. The price? 30 silver coins and a bottle of whiskey. But the silent mountain man who bought her that frozen night wasn't what anyone expected, least of all the broken young woman who thought she'd already lost everything. This is the story of Lydia Harper, the man who refused to break her, and the life that grew between them when the whole world said she was worthless. Stay with me until the end of this story. And if it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Lydia's story can travel. The town of Crestfall wasn't much to look at, even on its best days. A scatter of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of Wyoming territory, it survived on stubbornness and little else. The land was hard, the winters brutal, and the people harder still. Mercy was a luxury no one could afford, and compassion was a word spoken only by preachers passing through on their way to somewhere better. It was in this unforgiving place that Lydia Harper learned what it meant to be unwanted. She stood in the front room of her mother's house. Though calling it a house was generous. It was a shack, really, with gaps in the floorboards wide enough to see the frozen ground below and a roof that leaked every time it rained. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers hours ago, and no one had bothered to add more wood. Lydia wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in what little warmth remained in her body. Her mother sat at the table across from a man Lydia had never seen before. He was broad-shouldered and quiet, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a dark hat. His clothes were worn but clean, the kind of functional simplicity that came from a life spent working alone. He didn't look at Lydia. He hadn't looked at her once since he'd walked through the door. Margaret Harper, Lydia's mother, counted the coins on the table with sharp, eager fingers. Her face, lined and bitter from years of disappointment, showed no emotion beyond satisfaction. 30 silver coins. It was more money than she'd seen in months. "She's 6 months along," Margaret said flatly, as if describing a horse with a lame leg. "Healthy enough, though. Strong back. She can work." The man said nothing. He pushed the coins across the table. Margaret scooped them up quickly, as though afraid he might change his mind. Then she reached for the bottle of whiskey he'd set beside the money and uncorked it without hesitation. Lydia's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, to do something, anything, but her body felt frozen in place. Shame burned hotter than any fire. This was her mother, the woman who had given birth to her, raised her, taught her to sew and cook and survive. And now she was selling her like a piece of furniture she no longer needed. "She's trouble, though," Margaret added, taking a swig from the bottle. "Got herself in this condition by being foolish. Thought some smooth-talking drifter loved her. He didn't." Lydia flinched. The words cut deeper than any blade. The man still didn't speak. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was tall, taller than Lydia had realized, and there was something unsettling about his silence. Not threatening, exactly, but unreadable. She couldn't tell if he was angry, indifferent, or simply patient. Margaret waved a dismissive hand toward Lydia. "Take her. She's yours now." The man's gaze finally shifted to Lydia. His eyes were dark, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, but she thought she saw something in them, something she couldn't name. Not cruelty, not lust, just weariness. He gestured toward the door. Lydia didn't move. "Go on," Margaret snapped. "You deaf as well as stupid?" Lydia's hands trembled. She wanted to beg her mother to stop this, to take the money back, to give her one more chance. But she knew it would be useless. Margaret Harper had made her decision long before this man ever walked through the door, so Lydia walked. She stepped past her mother without a word, past the table where she'd eaten 1,000 meals, past the chair where her father used to sit before he died. She walked out into the freezing night, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known. The cold hit her like a fist. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the ground in white. The wind cut through her thin dress as though it were made of paper. She had no coat, no gloves, nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing inside her. The man followed her out and closed the door behind him. He didn't look back. A horse stood waiting in the street, a sturdy roan with a calm disposition. The man untied the reins and swung himself into the saddle with practiced ease. Then he reached down and offered Lydia his hand. She stared at it. For a moment she considered refusing, considered running, but where would she go? Back into that house, where her mother was already drunk and counting coins? Into the snow, where she'd freeze to death before dawn? Forward, into the unknown, with a man whose name she didn't even know? There were no good choices, only survival. Lydia took his hand. His grip was firm, but not rough. He pulled her up behind him with surprising gentleness, as though afraid she might break. She settled onto the horse's back, her swollen belly pressing awkwardly against his coat. She wrapped her arms around his waist to keep from falling, and the horse began to move. They rode in silence. Crestfall disappeared behind them, swallowed by the snow and the darkness. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through the trees. Lydia didn't know where they were going. She didn't know who this man was or what he wanted from her. All she knew was that she was leaving behind everything she'd ever known, and she wasn't sure if that made her free or more trapped than ever. The ride lasted hours. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner, colder, sharper. Lydia's fingers went numb where they gripped the man's coat. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. The baby shifted inside her, restless and uncomfortable. Still, the man said nothing. Lydia wanted to ask him where they were going. She wanted to ask his name, his intentions, his plans for her. But fear kept her silent. What if he was cruel? What if he expected things from her she couldn't give? What if he'd bought her for reasons she didn't want to imagine? So she stayed quiet, clinging to his back as the horse carried them deeper into the wilderness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man pulled the horse to a stop. Lydia lifted her head. Through the falling snow, she could just make out the shape of a cabin. It was small and simple, built from rough-hewn logs and nestled into the side of the mountain. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin, pale thread against the dark sky. A lantern glowed faintly in one of the windows. The man dismounted and helped Lydia down. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her when her feet touched the ground. She swayed, dizzy and exhausted, but he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. He gestured toward the cabin. Lydia took a shaky breath and walked toward the door. The man followed, leading the horse toward a small stable nearby. Inside the cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the room with flickering orange light. The space was clean and orderly, sparse but not neglected. There was a table, 2 chairs, a shelf lined with canned goods and supplies. A bed sat in the corner, covered with thick blankets. Everything was functional, practical, built to endure. Lydia stood just inside the doorway, unsure of what to do. The man came in behind her, shaking snow from his coat. He removed his hat and hung it on a peg by the door. For the first time, Lydia saw his face clearly. He was older than she'd thought, maybe in his mid-30s. His face was weathered and scarred, the kind of face that came from years of hard living. His hair was dark and unkempt, his jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. But his eyes, those dark, weary eyes, held something she hadn't expected: sadness. He moved past her without a word and began stoking the fire. Then he filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove to heat. He worked with quiet efficiency, his movements practiced and automatic. Lydia watched him, confused. Finally he spoke. "You take the bed." His voice was low and rough, as though he didn't use it often. Lydia blinked. "What?" He didn't repeat himself. He simply pointed toward the bed in the corner. Where will you sleep?" she asked hesitantly. He glanced toward the door. "Outside." "Outside?" Lydia's voice rose in disbelief. "It's freezing out there." He shrugged. "I've slept in worse." "But, take the bed," he said, again more firmly this time. "You need it more than I do." Lydia opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She didn't understand this man, didn't understand why he'd bought her, why he'd brought her here, why he was giving up his own bed and warmth for her comfort. It didn't make sense, but she was too tired to question it. She walked slowly toward the bed and sat down on the edge. The mattress was soft, softer than anything she'd slept on in years. The blanket smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. The man poured hot water into a basin and set it on the table along with a cloth. Warm yourself, he said quietly. There's food in the cupboard if you're hungry. Then he turned toward the door. Wait, Lydia said suddenly. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. What's your name? He was silent for a long moment. Then, without turning around, he answered. Ethan. Ethan Calder. And with that, he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Lydia sat alone in this warm cabin, staring at the fire. She didn't understand what had just happened. Didn't understand this quiet, somber man who had paid 30 silver coins for her and then locked himself out in the cold rather than share the same room. But for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called. Safe. Chen. The first night passed in restless, fragile sleep. Lydia woke several times, startled by unfamiliar sounds. The creak of settling logs, the hiss of wind against the walls, the soft crackle of the fire. Each time, she half expected to see Ethan Calder standing over her, his intentions finally revealed. But the cabin remained empty except for her. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, Lydia rose from the bed and moved cautiously toward the window. Snow blanketed the mountain in white, unbroken, and pristine. The world outside looked frozen in time. She heard movement near the stable. Through the frost-edged glass, she saw Ethan leading the horse out into the snow. He moved with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown the night before, checking the animal's hooves, adjusting the saddle, working as though the brutal cold didn't touch him at all. Lydia pressed a hand to her belly. The baby shifted beneath her palm, a small flutter of movement that reminded her she wasn't alone in this strange new place. The door opened. Ethan stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He didn't look at her. He crossed to the stove, added wood to the fire, and began preparing something that might charitably be called breakfast: coffee, hardtack, and a strip of dried venison. There's oats if you want something hot, he said without turning around. Lydia hesitated. I can cook. No need. I should earn my keep. Ethan paused. For a moment, he seemed to consider her words, then he shook his head. You're 6 months pregnant and just rode through a snowstorm in the middle of the night. Rest. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, but not an unkind one. Lydia didn't know how to respond. She'd spent her entire life being told she was a burden, a mistake, something to be endured rather than cared for. This man's simple, practical concern felt almost alien. She sat down at the table. Ethan set a tin cup of coffee in front of her and a bowl of oats sweetened with a bit of honey. Then he took his own cup and stood by the fire, staring into the flames. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Lydia spoke. Why did you buy me? Ethan didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of coffee, his expression unreadable. Needed help, he said eventually. Help with what? Winter's hard up here. Alone, Lydia frowned. You could have hired someone. A ranch hand. Someone who could actually work. Maybe. So why me? Ethan's jaw tightened. Because no one else would. The words hung in the air between them, blunt and honest. Lydia looked down at her hands. You know what I am. I know what they say you are. And you don't care? Ethan finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes were tired, but there was something steady in them, something unyielding. I care that you're here, he said quietly. That you're safe. That's all that matters. Lydia's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not after everything that had happened. You don't know me, she whispered. No, Ethan agreed, but I know enough. He set down his cup and reached for his coat. I've got work to do, he said. Stay inside, stay warm. There's more food in the cupboard if you need it. And then he was gone, stepping out into the cold morning without another word. Did that? The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, chopping wood, repairing fences, tending to the horse, hauling water from the creek. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were short and practical. He asked if she needed anything, told her where things were, warned her not to go outside alone in the snow. But he never asked questions, never demanded anything from her, never crossed the invisible line between them. At night, he would return to the cabin, cold and exhausted. He'd heat water for her to wash with, make sure the fire was stoked high enough to last through the night, and then leave, locking himself in the stable or the small workshop behind the cabin. Lydia didn't understand it. She'd been raised to believe that men took what they wanted, that a woman sold for 30 coins would be treated like property, used and discarded without a second thought. But Ethan Calder didn't take. He gave his bed, his warmth, his protection, and asked for nothing in return. It unsettled her. One evening, after nearly a week on the mountain, Lydia gathered her courage and confronted him. "Why do you sleep outside?" she asked as he prepared to leave for the night. Ethan paused, his hand on the door. "Told you. You need the bed." "That's not a reason," Lydia pressed. "You're freezing every night. You're exhausted. This is your home. You need it more." "Stop saying that!" Lydia's voice rose, frustration finally breaking through. "I'm not some fragile thing that's going to shatter if you look at me wrong. I can handle— I lost someone in that bed." The words came out flat, final, like the closing of a door. Lydia froze. Ethan didn't look at her. He stared at the floor, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Her name was Sarah," he continued quietly. "We'd been married 2 years. She was pregnant, 8 months along. Everything seemed fine. And then one night," he trailed off. Lydia's heart clenched. "She went into labor early," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "I rode down to Crestfall to get the doctor, but by the time we got back, it was too late. She was gone. The baby, too." Silence filled the cabin. Lydia didn't know what to say. What could she say? What words could possibly ease that kind of pain? "I buried them behind the cabin," Ethan continued, "under the pine tree, and I swore I'd never let it happen again." He finally looked at her, and Lydia saw the raw, unhealed grief in his eyes. "That's why I bought you," he said, "because when I saw you standing there, 6 months pregnant and unwanted, I saw her, and I couldn't walk away." Lydia's vision blurred with tears. "I'm not trying to replace her," Ethan added quickly. "I'm not asking you to be anything to me. I couldn't let another woman and child die because no one cared enough to help." Lydia wiped at her eyes, her hands shaking. "You're a good man, Ethan Calder," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "I'm just a man who's seen too much death." He turned toward the door again. "Ethan," Lydia said softly. He stopped. "You can sleep inside," she said. "There's room. I trust you." Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then, without a word, he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. But the next night, when the snow began to fall harder and the wind howled like a wounded animal, Lydia woke to find Ethan asleep in the chair by the fire. He hadn't taken the bed, but he'd finally come inside. And for Lydia, that felt like the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. The transition happened so gradually that Lydia almost didn't notice it at first. Ethan began sleeping in the chair more often. Not every night. Some evenings he still disappeared into the workshop or the stable, but enough that Lydia started leaving a blanket folded on the armrest for him. He never acknowledged it, but each morning the blanket would be neatly refolded and placed back where she'd left it. Small gestures became their language. Lydia would wake to find fresh water already heating on the stove. Ethan would return from hours in the cold to discover his coat mended, the torn seam carefully stitched closed. Neither of them spoke about these things. They simply existed. Quiet offerings exchanged between two people learning to share space without demanding more than the other could give. Winter deepened its grip on the mountain. The snow piled higher against the cabin walls, and the wind grew teeth that bit through every crack and seam. Lydia had never experienced cold like this, the kind that made your bones ache and your breath freeze in your lungs. But inside the cabin, the fire always burned warm, and there was always food, always water, always the solid presence of Ethan Calder working to keep them both alive. One afternoon, Lydia stood at the window watching him split firewood. His movements were methodical and powerful, the axe rising and falling in steady rhythm, each strike splitting the logs with practiced precision. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cold, and his breath came out in white clouds. She found herself wondering about him, about the life he'd lived before she arrived, about Sarah, the wife who died in the bed Lydia now slept in, about what it must be like to live alone on this mountain with nothing but memories and grief for company. The door opened and Ethan came in carrying an armload of split wood. He stacked it neatly beside the hearth, then straightened and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Storm's coming," he said without preamble. "Big one. We'll be snowed in for a few days." Lydia turned from the window. "How can you tell?" "Sky, wind, the way the birds are flying." He moved to the cupboard and began taking inventory of their supplies. "Got enough food. Water from the creek will freeze, but I've got barrels filled. We'll be fine. Is there anything I can do to help?" Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You can rest. That's help enough." Lydia bristled. "I'm pregnant, not dying. I can be useful." "Didn't say you couldn't." "Then let me do something," she insisted. "Anything. I can't just sit here while you do everything." Ethan was silent for a moment, considering. Then he nodded toward the table. "There's beans that need sorting. Some of them are starting to spoil. Could use someone with good eyes to pick through them." It was a small task, almost insignificant, but Lydia seized it like a drowning woman grabbing a rope. She settled at the table and began sorting through the dried beans, separating the good from the bad with careful attention. Ethan worked nearby, oiling the rifle that hung above the door, checking the ammunition, making sure everything was ready for whatever the storm might bring. "You ever use that?" Lydia asked, nodding toward the rifle. "When I need to." "For hunting?" "Sometimes." He paused. "Sometimes for other things." The weight in his voice made Lydia look up. "What other things?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He set the rifle down and moved to the stove to pour himself coffee. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. "Mountains not as isolated as it seems. Get drifters sometimes, men running from the law or running toward trouble. Most of them keep moving, some don't." A chill ran down Lydia's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Has anyone ever tried to, Once," Ethan interrupted. 3 years back, 2 men thought an empty cabin would be easy pickings. Didn't know I was home." "What happened?" "They left." The finality in his tone told Lydia not to ask for details. She returned her attention to the beans, her hands moving automatically while her mind wandered. She thought about her mother, probably drunk by now on the whiskey Ethan had traded for her daughter. She thought about Thomas, the man who'd whispered promises and planted a child in her belly before disappearing like smoke. She thought about the baby growing inside her, a life created from foolishness and abandoned by everyone except the silent stranger who'd paid 30 silver coins. "Why didn't you ask my name?" Lydia said suddenly. Ethan looked up from the rifle. "What?" "When you bought me. You never asked my name, you still haven't." He was quiet for a long moment. "Figured you'd tell me when you were ready." "It's Lydia," she said softly. "Lydia Harper." Ethan nodded once. "Lydia." The way he said it, simple and without judgment, made something tight in her chest loosen just a fraction. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For not treating me like I'm worthless." Ethan's jaw tightened. He set down the rifle and crossed to the table, standing across from her with his hands braced on the back of the empty chair. "You're not worthless," he said firmly. "Don't let anyone make you believe that. Not your mother. Not the man who left you. Not anyone." Lydia's eyes burned. "How can you say that? You don't even know me." "I know you survived," Ethan said. "I know you're still standing even after everyone gave up on you. That's not worthless. That's strength." A tear slipped down Lydia's cheek before she could stop it. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, as though unsure what to do. Then, slowly, he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, just for a moment, just long enough for the warmth to register, before pulling back. "Storm will be here soon," he said quietly. "Better get the shutters secured." And he was gone, stepping back into the cold before Lydia could find words to respond. She sat alone at the table, staring at her hand where his had briefly rested, and realized something that both terrified and comforted her. She was beginning to trust him. The storm hit that night with the force of something alive and angry. Wind screamed around the cabin like a wounded beast, rattling the shutters and tearing at the roof. Snow fell so thick and fast that Lydia couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The world outside disappeared into a wall of white chaos. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, and the cabin held firm against the onslaught. Ethan moved through the space with quiet efficiency, checking the door, reinforcing the shutters, making sure everything was battened down and secure. Lydia watched him work, marveling at his calm in the face of nature's fury. "This happen often?" she asked, raising her voice to be heard over the wind. "Every winter," Ethan replied. "Sometimes more than once. This one's worse than most." "How long will it last?" 2, maybe 3 days. Lydia wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling very small. "And we just wait?" Ethan nodded. "We wait." The first day passed slowly. They moved around each other in the confined space like careful dancers, never quite touching, never quite colliding. Lydia mended clothes and sorted supplies. Ethan carved something from a piece of wood, she couldn't tell what, while the storm raged outside. They spoke in fragments. "Coffee's ready?" "Thank you." "Need more wood?" "I'm fine." By the second day, the silence grew heavier. Lydia found herself watching Ethan more openly, studying the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the lines etched into his face by years of hard living. She noticed things she hadn't before: the scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands, the way he sometimes stared into the fire with an expression so distant it was like he'd left his body behind. "Tell me about her," Lydia said suddenly. Ethan looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. "Who?" "Sarah, your wife." His hands stilled. For a moment, Lydia thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, he set the carving aside. "What do you want to know?" "Anything," Lydia said softly. "Everything." Ethan stared into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, as though pulling words from some deep, forgotten place. "Met her in Crestfall," he began. "She was working at the general store. I'd come down from the mountain to buy supplies, and she smiled at me. Not many people smiled at me back then. I wasn't easy to be around." Lydia stayed quiet, afraid that if she spoke, he'd stop. "She was kind," Ethan continued, "patient. Saw something in me worth caring about, even when I couldn't see it myself. We got married that spring, built this cabin together. Every log, every nail, we did it together." His voice cracked slightly. "She loved it up here," he said. "Loved the quiet, the mountains. Used to say it felt like we were the only two people in the world." He paused. "When she got pregnant, I thought we'd have everything." "What was she like?" Lydia asked gently. A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. "Stubborn. Lord, she was stubborn. Wouldn't let me do anything for her once she started showing. Said she wasn't helpless just because she was carrying a baby." He shook his head. "Reminds me of you." Lydia's breath caught. "She sang," Ethan continued, "all the time. Didn't matter what she was doing, cooking, cleaning, mending, always singing. This cabin was full of music." "And then she died," Lydia said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Yeah, she died." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. "I'm sorry," Lydia whispered. "Not your fault." "I know, but I'm still sorry." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and Lydia saw something shift in his eyes, something that looked almost like gratitude. "I haven't talked about her in years," he said. "Not to anyone." "Why not?" "Because talking about her makes it real," Ethan said simply. "Makes it hurt all over again." Lydia understood that. She understood it better than he knew. "The man who left me," she said slowly, "his name was Thomas. He worked on one of the ranches outside Crestfall. He told me he loved me, told me we'd get married, have a family, build a life together." She looked down at her hands. "I believed him." "What happened?" "I told him I was pregnant," Lydia said, "and he was gone by morning, didn't even leave a note." Ethan's expression darkened. "If I ever see him—" "You won't," Lydia interrupted. "Men like Thomas don't come back. They just move on to the next girl stupid enough to believe them." "You're not stupid." "I was," Lydia said bitterly. "I was so desperate to be loved that I didn't see what was right in front of me. He didn't love me. He just wanted something from me. And once he got it, I stopped mattering." "You matter now," Ethan said firmly. Lydia met his eyes. "Do I?" "Yes." The single word hung between them, solid and unshakable. Lydia felt something break open inside her chest. something she'd been holding closed for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, and once they started, she couldn't make them stop. She cried for the mother who'd sold her, for the man who'd abandoned her, for the life she'd thought she'd have and the one she'd ended up with instead. She cried for herself, for the girl who'd believed love was real and the woman who'd learned it was just another lie people told to get what they wanted. And through it all, Ethan sat quietly across from her, not trying to fix it, not offering empty comfort, just being there. When the tears finally subsided, Lydia wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up. "I'm sorry," she said hoarsely. "Don't be." "I didn't mean to." "You needed to," Ethan said simply. "No shame in that." Lydia drew a shaky breath. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Trust someone again." Ethan stood and crossed to the stove. He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to Lydia, setting it on the table in front of her. "Then don't," he said quietly. "Not yet. Not until you're ready." "But I'm not going anywhere, Lydia," Ethan said. "You can take all the time you need." And for the first time since she'd been sold for 30 silver coins, Lydia felt something that almost resembled hope. By the 3rd day, the storm began to weaken. The wind died down to a dull roar, and the snow stopped falling in blinding sheets. Ethan ventured outside to check the damage and returned covered in white from head to toe. "Drifts are 6 feet high in some places," he reported, shaking snow from his coat. "Won't be able to ride down the mountain for at least a week. Maybe more." Lydia nodded. She'd expected as much. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan pulled out the piece of wood he'd been carving. He turned it over in his hands, examining it from different angles, then held it out to Lydia. "For you," he said. Lydia took it carefully. It was a small wooden bird carved with remarkable detail. Every feather was visible, every curve of the wing perfectly shaped. It was simple and beautiful and clearly made with great care. "It's lovely," Lydia breathed. "Sarah used to carve," Ethan said. "She was better at it than me. Taught me some before." He trailed off. "Anyway, thought you might like it." Lydia ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the edges and contours. "Thank you. It's just a bird." "No," Lydia said softly. "It's more than that." Ethan looked uncomfortable, as though he'd revealed more than he'd intended. He stood and moved toward the door. "I'll check on the horse," he muttered. "Ethan," Lydia called after him. He paused. "You don't have to sleep outside anymore," she said. "It's too cold, and I trust you." Ethan's shoulders tensed. For a moment, Lydia thought he might refuse again. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you." That night, Ethan slept in the chair by the fire while Lydia lay in the bed across the room. The space between them felt both vast and impossibly small. Lydia could hear his breathing, steady and even, and found it strangely comforting. She clutched the wooden bird in her hand and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she slept without nightmares. The days after the storm were filled with hard work. Ethan spent hours digging out the stable, clearing paths through the snow, making sure the horse had enough feed and water. Lydia helped where she could, preparing meals, mending gear, keeping the fire burning strong. They fell into an easy rhythm, moving around each other with growing familiarity. Conversations became longer, less guarded. Ethan told her stories about growing up on a farm in Montana, about learning to survive in the wilderness, about the years he'd spent alone on this mountain. Lydia shared memories of her childhood, the good ones, before her father died and her mother turned bitter and cruel. One morning, Lydia woke to find Ethan standing at the stove, frying eggs and bacon, a rare luxury he'd been saving. "What's the occasion?" she asked, sitting up. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "Baby's almost due, isn't it?" Lydia placed a hand on her swollen belly. "Another month, maybe." "Thought you could use something more than oats and hardtack." Lydia smiled, a real smile that felt strange and wonderful on her face. "Thank you." They ate together at the table, and for a brief moment it felt almost normal, almost like a life that could actually be lived. "I've been thinking," Ethan said after a while, "when the baby comes you'll need help, real help, doctor kind of help." Lydia's stomach tightened with fear. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to plan, Ethan said carefully. I can deliver a calf, even helped birth a foal once, but a baby? He shook his head. I won't take that risk, not again. You want to bring me down to Crestfall? Lydia's voice rose with panic. Back to my mother? Back to those people who... No, Ethan said firmly. Never back there. But there's another town, smaller, quieter, about 2 days' ride east. They've got a midwife. Good one. If we leave early enough, we can get you there before the baby comes. Lydia stared at him. You'd do that? Risk the journey? I'd risk more than that, Ethan said quietly. I won't lose another woman and baby, not if I can help it. Lydia's eyes burned with tears she was too proud to shed. I don't deserve your kindness. Everyone deserves kindness, Ethan said. Doesn't matter what anyone's done or where they've been. Everyone deserves to be treated like they matter. And in that moment, sitting across from this quiet, damaged man who'd saved her life without asking for anything in return, Lydia realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She was falling in love with him. The thought should have frightened her more than it did. She'd been burned before, abandoned, and betrayed by a man who'd whispered sweet promises and delivered nothing but pain. But Ethan Calder wasn't Thomas. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't speak in pretty words designed to manipulate and deceive. He simply showed up, day after day, and proved through his actions that she mattered. That was more powerful than any promise. Lydia looked down at her plate, afraid that if she met his eyes, he'd see the truth written all over her face. When should we leave? She asked quietly. Soon, Ethan said. Within the week. Snow's melting enough that the trails should be passable. Lydia nodded, her heart pounding. 1 week. 7 days to prepare for the journey, for the birth, for whatever came after. 7 days to figure out how to tell the man who'd saved her life that somewhere along the way, in the warmth of his cabin and the safety of his quiet presence, she'd stopped being afraid and started hoping for something she'd never dared to want before. A real home, a real family, a real future with him. But those 7 days never came. On the 4th morning after the storm, Lydia woke to the sound of horses. At first she thought she'd imagined it, some trick of the wind or a dream bleeding into waking. But then she heard voices, rough and demanding, and the unmistakable jingle of bridles and spurs. Ethan was already moving. He'd been splitting wood outside when the riders approached, and now he stood in the doorway with the axe still gripped in his hand, his body blocking the entrance to the cabin. His face was carved from stone, hard and unyielding. Stay inside, he said without turning around. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. Who is it? Don't know yet, but stay inside. Through the gap between Ethan's shoulder and the doorframe, Lydia could see them, 5 men on horseback, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. They wore heavy coats against the cold, and most of them had rifles slung across their saddles. They looked like men who were used to getting what they came for. The lead rider dismounted with practiced ease. He was tall and broad, with a thick beard shot through with gray and eyes that held the kind of authority that came from wealth and position. Lydia recognized him immediately, though she'd never spoken to him directly. Samuel Garrett, one of the most powerful landowners in the territory, a man whose word carried more weight than any law. Ethan Calder, Garrett said, his voice carrying easily across the snow. Been a while. Ethan didn't move. Garrett, mind if we come inside? It's damn cold out here. Yes, I mind. Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's unfortunate, because we've got business to discuss. Got no business with you. Oh, but you do. Garrett gestured toward the cabin. You've got something that belongs to someone else. Ethan's grip tightened on the axe. Everything here is mine. Not the girl. Lydia's blood turned to ice. Garrett took a step forward, and 2 of his men dismounted behind him, their hands resting casually on their holstered guns. The message was clear. They weren't leaving without what they came for. Margaret Harper came to me 3 days ago, Garrett continued. Said her daughter was taken against her will by a mountain man. Said she wants her back. That's a lie, Ethan said flatly. I paid for her, fair and square. With what? 30 pieces of silver? Garrett's smile widened. You can't buy a person, Calder. Not legally, not anymore. Tell that to every brothel and mining camp in the territory, Ethan shot back. Hell, tell it to yourself. I know what goes on at your ranch. Garrett's expression darkened. Watch yourself. Or what? You'll shoot me on my own land? Ethan's voice was cold and steady. Try it. See how far you get. And inside the cabin, Lydia pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. This was her fault. All of it. Her mother had done this, sent these men to drag her back, probably to sell her again to someone who'd pay more than 30 coins. She couldn't let that happen. Before Ethan could stop her, Lydia stepped forward and pushed past him into the doorway. The cold hit her like a slap, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet Garrett's eyes without flinching. I'm not going back, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Garrett looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her swollen belly with something like disgust. Girl, you don't have a choice. Your mother has debts to pay, and you're the collateral. My mother sold me, Lydia said. She took the money and spent it on whiskey. Whatever debts she has are hers, not mine. That's not how the law sees it. Then the law is wrong, Lydia shot back. I'm not property. I'm not something to be traded and sold whenever someone needs money. One of Garrett's men snorted. You sure acted like property when you spread your legs for some drifter and got yourself knocked up. Ethan moved so fast that Lydia barely saw it happen. One moment he was standing beside her, and the next he'd closed the distance between himself and the man who'd spoken, the axe raised and ready. Say that again, Ethan said quietly. I dare you. The man's hand went to his gun, but Garrett held up a hand. Easy, Garrett said. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Then leave, Ethan said. Get on your horses and ride back down this mountain before I give you a reason to regret coming up it. Garrett studied Ethan for a long moment, his expression calculating. Then he shifted his attention back to Lydia. You really want to stay here? He asked. With him, in this godforsaken place? Lydia didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? What's he offering you that's worth more than family? He's offering me dignity, Lydia said. Something my family never gave me. Garrett's jaw tightened. Your mother says he forced you to come here, that he threatened her. My mother is a liar, Lydia said flatly. She sold me to pay for her drinking. She didn't care where I went or what happened to me as long as she got her money. If you don't believe me, go back and ask her what she bought with those 30 coins. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Garrett's face. Even if that's true, he said slowly, the transaction wasn't legal. You can't sell a person. Then arrest my mother for trying, Lydia said. But I'm not going back to her. I'm staying here. You're pregnant, Garrett pointed out. What happens when that baby comes? You think this mountain man can keep you alive? He's kept me alive this long, Lydia said, which is more than anyone else ever tried to do. Ethan stepped back beside her, still holding the axe. She's made her choice. You heard her. Now leave. Garrett's eyes narrowed. You know what people are saying in Crestfall? They're saying you bought yourself a whore to warm your bed because no decent woman would come near you after what happened to your wife. Ethan's face went white with rage, but before he could respond, Lydia spoke. Then people in Crestfall are as cruel as they are stupid, she said coldly. Ethan Calder gave me his bed and slept outside in the snow so I'd feel safe. He fed me, clothed me, protected me, and never once asked for anything in return. If that's what you call a whore keeper, then I'd rather be his whore than a respectable woman in your town. The words hung in the frozen air like a slap. Garrett's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, girl. No, Lydia said. Lydia. The only mistake I made was believing people like you cared about anything other than money and reputation. Garrett turned to Ethan. This isn't over, Calder. The law says she can't be bought and sold like livestock. That means the transaction is void, which means, technically, she still belongs to her mother. She doesn't belong to anyone, Ethan said through gritted teeth. She's a human being, not property. Tell it to the judge. There is no judge out here, Ethan said. Just men with guns and the will to use them. And I'm telling you right now, you're not taking her. Garrett studied them both for a long moment. Then he smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made Lydia's skin crawl. Have it your way, he said. But when that baby comes and something goes wrong, don't come crying to Crestfall for help. You made your choice. Live with it. He turned and remounted his horse. His men followed suit, though more than one of them cast dark looks back at Ethan and Lydia. One more thing, Garrett called from the saddle. Your mother's offering a reward for your return. $50 to anyone who brings you back, dead or alive. Lydia's stomach dropped. Garrett tipped his hat mockingly. Might want to watch your back out here, Calder. A lot of desperate men in these mountains. $50 is a fortune to some of them. And with that, he spurred his horse forward, and the riders disappeared down the mountain trail. Ethan stood motionless for a long time, staring after them. Then, slowly, he lowered the axe and turned to Lydia. Get inside, he said quietly. Lydia opened her mouth to argue, but the look on his face stopped her. She stepped back into the cabin, and Ethan followed, closing and bolting the door behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan crossed to the rifle above the door and took it down, checking the ammunition with swift, practiced movements. What are you doing? Lydia asked, though she already knew. Making sure we're ready, Ethan said. Garrett wasn't bluffing. $50 is enough to bring every bounty hunter and drifter in the territory to this mountain. This is my fault, Lydia whispered. I should never have… Stop! Ethan's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts like a blade. This isn't your fault. It's your mother's, and Garrett's, and every other person who treats people like commodities to be bought and sold. But you're in danger because of me. I've been in danger before, Ethan said. I'm still here. He set the rifle on the table and turned to face her fully. His eyes were fierce, burning with an intensity Lydia had never seen before. Listen to me, he said. I made a choice when I brought you here. I knew what it might cost, and I'm telling you right now, I don't regret it, not for a second. Lydia's throat tightened. Why? Why would you risk everything for someone like me? Because someone should have, Ethan said simply. Someone should have stood up for you a long time ago, and since no one else did, I will. Tears spilled down Lydia's cheeks. You don't owe me anything. This isn't about owing, Ethan said. It's about doing what's right. He crossed to her and, for the first time since she'd arrived, placed his hands gently on her shoulders. You're safe here, he said firmly. I promise you that. No matter who comes, no matter what happens, I will keep you safe. Lydia wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that one man, no matter how strong or determined, could stand against the forces arrayed against them. But she knew the world, knew how it worked, knew that men like Garrett always won in the end. What if you can't? She whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then I'll die trying. The words were spoken with such absolute conviction that Lydia couldn't doubt them. This man, this quiet, damaged stranger who'd paid 30 coins for a pregnant woman no one else wanted, would give his life to protect hers. And she realized with sudden, terrible clarity that she couldn't let that happen. Maybe I should go back, she said quietly. No. If I go back, they'll leave you alone. I said no, Ethan repeated, more forcefully this time. You're not going back to that woman. You're not going back to Garrett or anyone else who wants to use you. You're staying here. But this isn't up for discussion, Lydia. Ethan's hands tightened on her shoulders. You're staying. We're going to get through this. Together. Lydia searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. She found none. Why do you care so much? She asked, her voice breaking. Why does it matter to you what happens to me? Ethan was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because I failed Sarah, he said. I failed her and our baby, and I've lived with that guilt every day since. I can't change what happened to them, but I can make sure it doesn't happen to you. I'm not her, Lydia said softly. I know, Ethan said. You're not, but that doesn't mean you deserve any less protection, any less care. The word hung between them, fragile and significant. Lydia realized her hands had come up to rest on Ethan's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. They stood so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Ethan, she whispered. He pulled back abruptly, as though suddenly aware of how close they were. He cleared his throat and stepped away, putting distance between them. I should secure the perimeter, he said gruffly. Make sure there aren't any weak points in the defenses. And before Lydia could respond, he was gone, stepping back out into the cold and leaving her alone with her racing heart and the terrifying realization that she was in far deeper than she'd ever intended to be. The days that followed were tense and watchful. Ethan barely slept. He spent most of his time outside, patrolling the area around the cabin, checking for tracks in the snow, listening for sounds that didn't belong. At night, he sat by the window with the rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement. Lydia tried to help where she could, but her growing belly made her clumsy and slow. The baby seemed to sense her anxiety, kicking and shifting restlessly. She found herself talking to the child, whispering reassurances she didn't quite believe. "We're going to be all right," she murmured, one hand on her stomach. "Your father." She stopped, the word catching in her throat. Ethan wasn't the baby's father. Thomas was. But Thomas was gone, disappeared like smoke, and Ethan was here, standing guard, willing to die to keep them safe. Didn't that make him more of a father than the man who'd planted the seed and run? On the third night after Garrett's visit, Lydia woke to the sound of voices outside. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the hearth. Ethan was already on his feet, rifle in hand, moving toward the window with silent precision. "How many?" Lydia whispered. "3, maybe 4, Ethan replied quietly. "Stay down." Lydia pressed herself against the wall, her hands instinctively covering her belly. Outside, she could hear men talking in low, urgent voices. "You sure this is the place?" "Garrett said the cabin on the north face. This is it." "Don't see any light. Maybe nobody's home." "Someone's home. Look at the smoke from the chimney." Ethan moved to the door, positioning himself beside it with the rifle aimed and ready. His face was calm, almost eerily so, like a man who'd done this before. "Calder," one of the men called out. "We know you're in there. We don't want trouble. Just send out the girl and we'll leave peaceful." Ethan didn't respond. "Come on, Calder. Don't make this harder than it has to be. $50 ain't worth dying for." Still, Ethan remained silent. Lydia could hear the men moving outside, spreading out, trying to surround the cabin. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as though protesting the danger. "Last chance, Calder," the voice called again. "Send her out or we're coming in." Ethan glanced back at Lydia. Their eyes met across the dark cabin, and in that moment an entire conversation passed between them without words. Then Ethan turned back to the door and spoke, his voice carrying clear and cold through the wood. "You want her?" he said. "Come and take her." The silence that followed was heavy with menace. Then came the sound of boots on the porch. The door exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood. A man came through fast, gun drawn, but Ethan was faster. The rifle butt caught him across the jaw, and he went down hard. Another man appeared in the doorway, and Ethan fired. The shot was deafening in the confined space, and the man stumbled backward with a cry of pain. "Stay back," Ethan roared. "The next one goes through the heart." Outside, the remaining men hesitated. Lydia could hear them arguing in harsh whispers, trying to decide whether $50 was worth the cost. "We've got you outnumbered, Calder," one of them shouted. "Then come on in and prove it," Ethan shot back. "But I'm telling you right now, first man through that door dies. Second one too. Maybe the third gets me, but is it worth it? Is $50 worth dying for?" The silence stretched long and taut. Then slowly, the sounds of boots retreated across the porch and down the steps. Horses whinnied and stamped, and moments later came the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Ethan stood at the door for a long time, rifle still raised, listening to make sure they were really gone. The man on the floor groaned and tried to rise, but Ethan stepped on his wrist, pinning it to the ground. "You've got two choices," Ethan said quietly. "You can ride out of here and never come back, or you can stay here and freeze to death. What's it going to be?" The man looked up at Ethan's face, and whatever he saw there made his decision easy. "I'll go," he gasped. "I'll go. Just let me up." Ethan stepped back, and the man scrambled to his feet, clutching his broken jaw. He stumbled out the door and disappeared into the night, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Ethan closed what remained of the door and braced it shut with a heavy beam. Then, finally, he lowered the rifle and turned to Lydia. She was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. Ethan crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "It's over," he murmured. "They're gone. You're safe." Lydia clung to him, her fingers digging into his shirt. "They'll come back, more of them. They won't stop until... Then I'll stop them." Ethan said fiercely. Every single one. I don't care how many come. I won't let them take you. Oh, Lydia pulled back just enough to look up at his face. Why? She demanded. Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much? Ethan's jaw worked, and for a moment Lydia thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, he raised one hand and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. Because somewhere along the way, he said quietly, you stopped being just someone I was protecting. You became someone I couldn't stand to lose. Lydia's breath caught. I know I've got no right, Ethan continued. I know you've been hurt before, and I know you've got every reason not to trust any man ever again, but I need you to know I'm not him. I'm not the man who left you. I'm not going anywhere. Lydia's heart felt like it might burst out of her chest. Ethan, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted. I just needed you to know, whatever happens, whatever comes next, you matter to me, more than I thought anyone could again. And before Lydia could think, before fear or doubt could stop her, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was brief and chaste, just a soft press of lips, but it felt like the world shifting on its axis. Ethan went perfectly still, as though afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Then, slowly, his arms tightened around her, holding her close but careful, as though she were something precious and breakable. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Lydia, Ethan said hoarsely, we shouldn't. No, she whispered. I know all the reasons why this is a bad idea, but I don't care. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions for me. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling it thunder beneath her palm. You saved me, she said. Not just from my mother or from those men. You saved me from believing I was worthless. You made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth protecting. And She took a shaky breath. I'm falling in love with you, Ethan called her, and I don't know what to do about it. Ethan closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with emotion. I'm falling in love with you too, he said roughly. Have been for weeks. Maybe since the first night you looked at me like I was something other than a monster. Lydia laughed through her tears. You're the furthest thing from a monster I've ever met. Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. We're going to get through this, he promised. We're going to survive whatever comes. And when it's over, when it's safe, when it's over, Lydia finished, we're going to build a life together, a real one, the three of us. She placed Ethan's hand on her swollen belly, and they both felt the baby kick, strong and insistent, a promise of the future waiting to be born. The kick beneath Ethan's palm felt like a miracle and a warning all at once. He held his hand there for a long moment, feeling the life moving inside Lydia, and something fierce and protective surged through him. This child, this innocent life that had done nothing to deserve the cruelty the world had already shown its mother, deserved better, deserved safety, deserved a chance. We need to leave, he said quietly, his hand still resting on her belly. Tonight. Lydia's eyes widened. What? But it's dark and the trail is dangerous, I know, Ethan interrupted. But staying here is more dangerous. Those men will be back and they'll bring more with them. We can't defend this place forever. Where will we go? Ethan's mind raced, calculating distances and risks. There's a settlement 2 days east, small place, quiet. They've got a midwife there, woman named Ruth. She's delivered half the babies in the territory and hasn't lost a mother yet. 2 days? Lydia placed a hand on her belly. Ethan, I'm 8 months along. What if the baby comes on the trail? Then I'll deliver it myself, Ethan said firmly. But we can't stay here, not anymore. Lydia searched his face and saw the truth there. This cabin, the place that had been her sanctuary, had become a trap. As long as she stayed here, men would keep coming, drawn by the promise of easy money and a woman who supposedly belonged to someone else. All right, she said quietly. We'll go. Ethan nodded and immediately began moving, his actions swift and purposeful. He pulled down supply packs from hooks on the wall and began filling them with essentials. Dried meat, hardtack, coffee, blankets, ammunition. Every movement was efficient, born from years of living alone and preparing for the worst. Lydia tried to help, but her swollen belly made her clumsy. She knocked over a tin cup, and it clattered across the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Sit, Ethan said gently. Rest while you can. The ride's going to be hard. I can help. You can help by staying strong, Ethan said, pausing to look at her. I need you ready for what's coming. Please. Lydia sank into the chair, her hands trembling. Fear coiled in her stomach alongside the baby. 2 days on horseback and her condition seemed impossible, but staying here seemed like a death sentence. Within an hour, Ethan had packed everything they'd need and secured it to the horse. He'd saddled the roan carefully, making sure the straps were tight and the weight was balanced. Then he came back inside one last time. Lydia looked around the cabin. At the bed where she'd slept, the hearth where she'd warmed herself, the table where she'd shared meals with the man who'd saved her life. This place had given her something she'd never had before: peace, safety, hope. I know, Ethan said quietly, understanding written on his face. But we'll find another place. Build something new, something that's ours. What about Sarah? Lydia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her grave is here. You can't just leave her. Ethan's jaw tightened. He crossed to the mantel and took down a small wooden box Lydia had never noticed before. Inside was a lock of dark hair and a simple silver ring. I carry her with me, he said simply, tucking the box into his coat. Always have. Always will. But she'd understand. She'd want me to protect the living. He held out his hand to Lydia. Come on. We need to move while it's still dark. Lydia took his hand and let him help her to her feet. Her back ached and her feet were swollen, but she forced herself to move. Ethan wrapped her in the warmest coat they had and led her outside. The night was brutally cold, the kind of cold that stole the breath from your lungs and turned your fingers numb in seconds. The moon hung pale and distant overhead, casting long shadows across the snow. Ethan helped Lydia onto the horse, settling her as comfortably as possible in the saddle, then swung up behind her. Hold on to me, he murmured in her ear. Don't let go no matter what happens. Lydia wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed herself against his back, drawing what warmth she could from his body. The baby shifted restlessly inside her, as though sensing the danger and uncertainty ahead. Ethan urged the horse forward, and they left the cabin behind, descending into the darkness. The trail down the mountain was treacherous in daylight. At night, it was nearly suicidal. The path was narrow and icy, with steep drops on one side that disappeared into shadow. The horse picked its way carefully, each step deliberate and cautious. Ethan guided the animal with steady hands, murmuring encouragement, his body tense with concentration. Lydia kept her eyes closed for most of the descent, trusting Ethan to see them safely down. Every time the horse stumbled or slipped, her heart lurched into her throat. But Ethan always corrected, always adjusted, always kept them moving forward. Hours passed in cold, fearful silence. By the time they reached the base of the mountain, the first gray light of dawn was spreading across the eastern horizon. Ethan didn't stop. He pushed the horse onward, following a barely visible trail that wound through dense forest. How much farther? Lydia asked, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. Half a day to the first way station, Ethan replied. We can rest there, get warm, let the horse recover. Then another day and a half to the settlement. Lydia nodded against his back. Her entire body ached, and the baby seemed to be pressing down with increasing urgency. She tried to ignore the discomfort, tried to focus on staying conscious and upright, but exhaustion pulled at her like a weight. Talk to me, Ethan said suddenly. Keep yourself awake. Tell me something. Like what? Anything. Tell me about when you were a girl, before everything went wrong. Lydia thought back through the years, searching for memories that weren't tainted by bitterness or pain. Finally, she found one. My father used to take me fishing, she said softly. There was a creek near our house, and on summer evenings, we'd go sit on the bank and throw in our lines. We never caught much. A few trout, maybe a catfish if we were lucky, but that wasn't the point. What was the point? Ethan asked gently. Being together, Lydia said. Just the two of us. He'd tell me stories about when he was young, about the places he'd been and the things he'd seen. He had this way of making everything sound like an adventure, even the ordinary things. He sounds like a good man. He was, Lydia whispered. Best man I ever knew. When he died, it felt like all the light went out of the world. My mother was never the same after. She got hard, mean, started drinking, started blaming me for things that weren't my fault. That wasn't right. Ethan said quietly. None of that was your fault. I know, Lydia said, but knowing it and believing it are different things. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through the trees. What about you? Lydia asked. Tell me about before Sarah, before this mountain. Ethan was quiet for so long that Lydia thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. I grew up on a farm in Montana, he said. My father was a hard man. Not cruel, just hard. He believed in work and discipline and nothing else. My mother was the opposite, soft, gentle, always singing while she worked. She died when I was 12. Fever took her in 3 days. I'm sorry, Lydia murmured. After she was gone, my father got even harder, Ethan continued. Couldn't stand to be in that house anymore, I think. Too many memories. He worked himself to death within 2 years. Left me the farm, but I couldn't stay there either. So I sold it and headed west. How did you end up here? Wandered for a while, Ethan said. Worked odd jobs, saved money. Met Sarah in Crestfall when I was passing through. She was the first person who looked at me and saw something worth keeping. His voice roughened. Made me believe I could be more than just my father's son, more than just someone who survived. She was right, Lydia said softly. You are more. Ethan didn't respond, but his arms tightened slightly around her, and Lydia felt the warmth of his gratitude without words. The sun climbed higher as they rode, and the temperature rose just enough to make the cold bearable. But Lydia's discomfort grew with each passing mile. The baby pressed down relentlessly, and sharp pains shot through her lower back. She gritted her teeth and said nothing, unwilling to slow them down when danger might still be following. But Ethan noticed. How bad is it? He asked quietly. I'm fine. Lydia, she sighed. It hurts, but I can manage. Ethan cursed under his breath. We need to get you off this horse. Give you a chance to rest properly. You said the way station is half a day away. And I'm pushing too hard, Ethan interrupted. I'm going to stop at the next clearing. Let you stretch. Let the horse rest. We'll make up the time later. True to his word, when they reached a small clearing beside a frozen stream, Ethan dismounted and helped Lydia down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet touched the ground, and she would have fallen if Ethan hadn't caught her. Easy, he murmured, supporting her weight. Take your time. Lydia leaned against him, breathing hard, waiting for the dizziness to pass. When it finally did, she pulled back and tried to walk, but the pain in her back intensified with each step. Something's wrong, she gasped. Ethan's face went pale. What kind of wrong? I don't know. It hurts. Everything hurts. Ethan guided her to a fallen log and helped her sit. Then he knelt in front of her, his hands gentle on her knees. Look at me, he said firmly. Is the baby moving? Lydia placed a hand on her belly and concentrated. After a moment, she felt the familiar flutter of movement. Yes, she said, relief flooding through her. Yes, it's moving. Ethan's shoulders sagged. That's good. That's good. But the pain? Could be nothing, Ethan said, though his eyes betrayed his worry. Could be the ride, the stress, the cold, or it could be your body getting ready. Ready for what? For labor. The words hung between them like a sword. But it's too early, Lydia whispered. I'm only 8 months. The baby's not ready. 8-month babies can survive, Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Ruth, the midwife, she's delivered early babies before. If we can get you to her in time, and if we can't, Ethan's jaw set in a hard line, then I'll do what needs to be done. I won't let you die, Lydia. I won't let that baby die. I swear it. Lydia wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that sheer determination could overcome biology and circumstance, but fear clawed at her throat, making it hard to breathe. What if you can't save us both? She asked quietly. What if you have to choose? Don't, Ethan said sharply. Don't even think like that. But if it comes to it, it won't. Ethan, I said it won't, Ethan repeated, his voice raw with emotion. I'm not choosing. I'm saving both of you. That's the only option I'm accepting. Lydia searched his face, and saw the desperation there, the fear he was trying so hard to hide. This man who'd lost everything once before was terrified of history repeating itself, and she realized that her fear wasn't just for herself and her baby. It was for him too, for what it would do to him if he failed again. "All right," she said softly. "We keep going. We get to Ruth. We do this together." Ethan nodded and stood, helping her to her feet. They rested for a few more minutes, letting the horse drink from the stream and graze on what little grass poked through the snow. Then they mounted again and continued eastward. The pain in Lydia's back continued to worsen as the day wore on. It came in waves now, sharp and relentless, stealing her breath and making her grip Ethan's coat so tightly her knuckles went white. She tried to hide it, tried to stay quiet, but eventually a small cry escaped her lips. Ethan pulled the horse to an immediate stop. "How far apart?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "What?" "The pains. How far apart are they?" Lydia thought back, trying to track the timing. "I don't know, maybe half an hour?" Ethan cursed and urged the horse faster. "We need to reach the way station. Now!" They rode hard, the horse's hooves pounding against the frozen ground. Lydia clung to Ethan, each jolt sending fresh pain through her body. The baby shifted and pressed down, and she could feel something changing inside her, something fundamental and unstoppable. The way station appeared through the trees just as the sun began to set. A rough-hewn structure that looked barely more substantial than a shed, but smoke rose from its chimney and lamplight glowed in the single window. Ethan brought the horse to a skidding halt and practically fell from the saddle in his haste to help Lydia down. Her legs wouldn't hold her this time, and she collapsed against him, gasping. "I've got you," Ethan murmured, scooping her into his arms as though she weighed nothing. "I've got you." He kicked open the door to the way station and carried her inside. The interior was sparse but warm. A fire burned in a stone hearth, and rough bunks lined the walls. An old man sat at a scarred table, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. He looked up in surprise as Ethan burst in. "Need help," Ethan said shortly. "She's in labor." The old man's eyes widened. "There's no doctor here, son. No midwife. Just me." "Then you'll have to do," Ethan said, carrying Lydia to the nearest bunk and laying her down gently. "You got clean water? Blankets? Anything?" The old man scrambled to his feet. "I'll heat water, get blankets, but I ain't never delivered a baby before." "Neither have I," Ethan said grimly. "But we're going to learn fast." Lydia gripped Ethan's hand as another contraction hit, this one stronger than the last. She cried out, unable to hold it back, and Ethan's face went white. "How long between them now?" the old man asked, moving to the fire to heat water. 10 minutes, maybe less," Ethan said. The old man shook his head. "You ain't making it to the settlement, son. This baby's coming tonight." Ethan looked down at Lydia, and she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. This was his nightmare come to life, a woman in labor, too far from help, with nothing but his own inadequate hands to save her. "Don't leave me!" Lydia gasped, gripping his hand tighter. "Never," Ethan said fiercely. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." The old man brought hot water and clean cloth, then retreated to the far corner of the room to give them privacy. Ethan stayed beside Lydia, holding her hand, wiping sweat from her forehead, murmuring words of encouragement even as terror ate away at him from the inside. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and fear. Lydia had never known such agony existed. It felt like her body was being torn apart from the inside, wave after wave of relentless pressure and pain. She screamed until her throat was raw, clutched Ethan's hand until her fingers went numb, begged for it to stop even though she knew it wouldn't. And through it all, Ethan stayed. He didn't flinch when she crushed his hand, didn't look away when things got difficult, didn't run when the fear threatened to overwhelm him. He stayed solid and present, his voice steady even when his hand shook. "You're doing so well," he told her. "You're so strong. Just a little longer. Just hold on a little longer." Lydia wanted to believe him, wanted to think that strength alone could carry her through this. But as the night deepened and the pain intensified, she began to wonder if she'd survive to see the dawn. "I'm scared," she gasped between contractions. "Ethan, I'm so scared." Ethan leaned close, his forehead pressed to hers. "I know. I'm scared too, but we're going to get through this. You and me and this baby, we're all going to be all right. You can't know that. I have to believe it, Ethan said hoarsely, because the alternative is unacceptable. Another contraction hit, stronger than any before, and Lydia screamed. The old man called out that he could see the baby's head, that she needed to push, and Lydia bore down with every ounce of strength she had left. Ethan's face was white as paper, his eyes wide with fear and awe. His hands trembled as he helped guide the baby, following the old man's shouted instructions, doing everything he could to help, despite having no idea what he was doing. And then, in a rush of blood and fluid and overwhelming relief, the baby came. For one terrible, eternal moment, there was silence. The baby lay still and quiet in Ethan's shaking hands, and Lydia's heart stopped. Not again, she thought desperately. Please, not again. But then the old man grabbed the baby and turned it over, rubbing its back vigorously. And suddenly, miraculously, a thin wail pierced the air. The baby was crying. The baby was alive. Lydia burst into tears, and Ethan made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. The old man wrapped the baby in clean cloth and handed her, it was a girl, to Lydia. She was tiny and red-faced and perfect. Her eyes were squeezed shut against the brightness of the world, and her little fists waved in protest at being born. But she was breathing, she was healthy, she was here. You did it, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. You did it, Lydia. She's perfect. Lydia cradled her daughter against her chest, feeling the rapid beat of that tiny heart, and couldn't find words. She'd carried this child for 8 months, been abandoned because of her, sold because of her, nearly died bringing her into the world. And now here she was, real and alive and dependent on Lydia for everything. What will you name her? The old man asked, hovering nearby with a proud smile on his weathered face. Lydia looked up at Ethan. His eyes were red-rimmed and wet, his face exhausted but transformed by wonder. Anna, she said softly. Her name is Anna. Ethan's breath caught. Like the girl your mother wanted to name you if you'd been a daughter, Lydia finished. She'd heard the story during one of their long conversations in the cabin. Sarah told you about it, didn't she? About the name your mother loved? Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Then Anna it is, Lydia whispered, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Anna Calder. The name hung in the air between them, a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope, between everything that had been and everything that could still be. Calder? Ethan repeated hoarsely. Lydia met his eyes. If you'll have us? Ethan knelt beside the bunk, his hand gentle on the baby's head, his eyes locked on Lydia's face. I'll have you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. If you'll have me. I know I'm not her father by blood. I know I've got no legal claim to either of you. But if you'll let me, if you'll trust me, I swear I'll spend every day of my life earning the right to call you both mine. Lydia's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of joy rather than pain. You already have, she whispered. You earned it the moment you gave me your bed and locked yourself in the cold. You earned it every day you protected me, every moment you made me feel like I mattered. She reached out and took his hand, placing it over the baby's tiny heart. She's yours, Lydia said firmly, in every way that matters. And so am I. Ethan bent his head, and Lydia felt his tears fall warm against her skin. He stayed there for a long time, one hand on his daughter, the other holding tight to the woman who'd become his whole world, and let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved this second chance at happiness. The old man, whose name turned out to be Jacob, insisted they stay at the way station for 3 days before continuing to the settlement. Lydia was weak from the delivery, and little Anna needed time to adjust to the world outside the womb. Ethan didn't argue. He knew pushing too hard too soon could cost them everything they'd just gained. Those 3 days passed in a strange, suspended peace. The world outside continued its harsh indifference, but inside the way station, a fragile new family took its first tentative breaths. Lydia spent most of her time in bed, recovering her strength while Anna nursed and slept against her chest. Ethan hovered nearby, restless and vigilant, checking the door every few hours, making sure no riders approached. Jacob proved to be more help than his initial protests suggested. He'd raised 4 children of his own before losing his wife to cholera, and though his memory was foggy on the details, his hands remembered what to do. He showed Ethan how to swaddle Anna properly, how to recognize when she was hungry versus tired, how to support her tiny head. "You're a natural," Jacob observed on the second morning, watching Ethan cradle the baby with surprising gentleness. "Most men are scared to death of something so small." "I am scared," Ethan admitted quietly, "terrified, but that doesn't change what needs to be done." Jacob nodded approvingly. "That's the mark of a good father. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it." Ethan looked down at Anna's sleeping face, at the impossible smallness of her features, and felt something shift permanently inside his chest. He'd thought loving Sarah was the deepest emotion he could experience, but this fierce protective tenderness for a child who shared none of his blood, felt like something even more fundamental, more primal. Lydia watched him from the bed, her expression soft. "You're good with her." Ethan glanced up, almost embarrassed to be caught staring at the baby with such obvious devotion. "She makes it easy." "No," Lydia said gently. "You make it look easy. There's a difference." By the third day, Lydia could walk without assistance, though she tired easily. Anna had settled into a routine of nursing and sleeping, her tiny lungs proving stronger than anyone had dared hope for an early baby. Ethan decided they were ready to continue to the settlement. Jacob helped them prepare, packing supplies and offering advice about the trail ahead. When they were ready to leave, he pressed a small bundle into Lydia's hands. "Some dried herbs," he explained. "Help with milk production and healing. Ruth will know what to do with them." But Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for everything. We wouldn't have survived without you." Jacob waved off her gratitude with gruff embarrassment. "Just happened to be here when you needed someone. That's all." "That's everything," Lydia corrected softly. Ethan shook the old man's hand firmly. "If you're ever near the Eastern Settlement, look for us. We owe you more than we can repay." Jacob smiled. "Just raise that baby to be strong and kind. That's payment enough." They rode out as the sun climbed above the tree line, Lydia cradling Anna inside her coat to keep her warm. The baby slept peacefully through the journey, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait. Ethan kept the pace slow and steady, stopping frequently to let Lydia rest and nurse. The settlement appeared late the following afternoon, a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley where three creeks converged. It was larger than Lydia had expected, with a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and perhaps 24 houses scattered along dirt roads. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see people moving between buildings, going about their daily business. "Ruth's place is on the east side," Ethan said, guiding the horse through the main street. "The house with the blue door. And they found it easily enough. A tidy cabin with curtains in the windows and a well-tended garden sleeping beneath the snow." Ethan helped Lydia dismount, and they approached the door together. Before Ethan could knock, it swung open. A woman stood in the doorway, perhaps 50 years old, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that took in everything at once. Lydia's exhausted pallor, the bundle in her arms, Ethan's protective stance. "You're late," she said without preamble. "I expected you 2 days ago." Ethan blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Got word from Jacob," Ruth interrupted, stepping aside to let them in. "He sent a rider ahead, said you had a baby on the way and might need help." Her eyes softened as she looked at the bundle in Lydia's arms. "Looks like the baby didn't wait." "No," Lydia said quietly. "She didn't." Ruth gestured them inside where warmth and the smell of fresh bread wrapped around them like an embrace. The interior was cozy and immaculately clean, with herbs hanging from the ceiling beams and shelves lined with jars of medicinal supplies. "Let me see her," Ruth said, washing her hands in a basin before approaching Lydia. Lydia carefully unwrapped Anna and held her out. Ruth took the baby with practiced ease, examining her with gentle, competent hands. She checked Anna's breathing, her color, the strength of her grip, the alertness of her eyes. "Early, but healthy," Ruth pronounced after a thorough inspection. "Someone did a good job delivering her." "That would be Jacob," Ethan said. "And dumb luck." Ruth handed Anna back to Lydia. "Luck had nothing to do with it. This baby's a fighter. Takes after her mother, I'd wager." She turned her attention to Lydia next, asking pointed questions about the delivery, the bleeding, the pain, Lydia answered honestly, and Ruth nodded with each response, occasionally making small sounds of approval. "You're healing well," Ruth finally declared, "but you need rest, real rest, and good food. You're both staying here until I say otherwise." "We don't want to impose," Lydia began. "Not an imposition," Ruth said firmly. "It's what I do. Besides, I've got more room than I know what to do with since my husband passed. You'll stay in the back room, no arguments." Ethan and Lydia exchanged glances. They'd planned to find lodging somewhere in town, perhaps work for their keep until they could figure out their next move. But Ruth's offer, blunt as it was, felt like another small miracle in a journey full of them. "Thank you," Lydia said softly. "We're grateful." Ruth snorted. "Save your gratitude. You'll earn your keep once you're stronger. I can always use help around here." She looked at Ethan. "You any good with your hands?" "I can build, repair, whatever needs doing." "Good. Roof's been leaking on the south side. You fix that, we'll call it even." And just like that, they had a place to stay. The back room was small but comfortable, with a proper bed and a cradle that Ruth dragged out from storage. That first night in the settlement, Lydia lay in a real bed for the first time in what felt like forever, with Anna sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside her and Ethan stretched out on a bedroll on the floor. "You could take the bed," Lydia whispered into the darkness. "There's room." "I'm fine here," Ethan replied quietly. Lydia smiled to herself. Some things, it seemed, didn't change. Ethan Calder would always choose the harder path if it meant protecting someone else's comfort. "Ethan?" she said after a moment. "Yeah?" "Thank you for getting us here, for keeping us safe, for everything." She heard him shift in the darkness. "You don't need to thank me." "I do, though. You gave us a future when we had none. That deserves more than thanks, but it's all I have to offer right now." "You've already given me more than you know," Ethan said quietly. "You gave me a reason to keep going, a reason to believe I could be more than just a man haunted by ghosts." Lydia reached down and found his hand in the darkness. Their fingers intertwined, and they lay there in comfortable silence until sleep claimed them both. The days in the settlement fell into a gentle rhythm. Ruth proved to be exactly what they needed: practical, no nonsense, and fiercely protective of her unexpected guests. She taught Lydia about caring for a newborn, sharing wisdom earned from decades of midwifery. She fed them hearty meals and made sure Lydia rested, even when she protested that she felt fine. Ethan fixed Ruth's roof as promised, then moved on to other repairs around the property. Word spread quickly through the small community that there was a skilled carpenter staying with Ruth, and soon people were stopping by with requests. A broken wagon wheel here, a sagging porch there. Ethan accepted the work gratefully, knowing they'd need money and supplies eventually. The settlement proved to be everything Crestfall wasn't: welcoming, curious but not cruel, willing to accept newcomers without demanding their entire history in exchange. People asked polite questions about where they'd come from and made no judgment about Lydia's circumstances or the baby's questionable parentage. But the peace couldn't last forever. 3 weeks after their arrival, as Ethan was finishing repairs on the blacksmith's forge, a rider came through town asking questions. Ethan heard about it from the blacksmith, a burly man named Thomas who'd become something of a friend. "Fellow came through this morning," Thomas said, pumping the bellows to heat the forge. "Asking about a pregnant woman and a mountain man. Offered money for information." Ethan's hand stilled on the hammer he'd been using. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Thomas said flatly. "Told him we don't make a habit of selling out our neighbors for coin." He didn't like that answer much, but he moved on. "Did he say who sent him?" "Didn't have to. Had that Garrett look about him. You know the type. Thinks money makes him better than everyone else." Ethan set down the hammer carefully. "I should go." "Go where?" Thomas asked. "That fellow's going to keep looking until he finds what he's after. Running just means he catches you on the road instead of here where you've got people willing to stand with you." "I won't bring trouble to this town." "Trouble's already here," Thomas pointed out. "Question is whether you're going to face it or run from it." Ethan looked at this blacksmith, at this man who barely knew him but was offering support anyway, and felt something loosen in his chest. He'd spent so many years alone, relying only on himself, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have people on his side. "I need to talk to Lydia," Ethan said. "Go," Thomas said. "I'll keep an ear out. Anyone else comes asking questions, I'll send word. Ethan found Lydia at Ruth's house, sitting in the rocking chair by the window with Anna nursing contentedly. She looked up when he entered, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. What's wrong? Ethan told her about the rider, about Garrett's continued pursuit. Lydia's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. They won't stop, will they? Not as long as there's money in it, Ethan said grimly. Ruth, who'd been listening from the kitchen, emerged with her arms crossed. So what's your plan? Run again? Keep running until you run out of places to hide. We can't stay here and put everyone in danger, Lydia said. This town's seen danger before, Ruth said sharply. We've dealt with bandits, weather, disease, and worse. We don't abandon our own just because things get difficult. We're not your own, Lydia protested. We've only been here 3 weeks. You've been here long enough, Ruth interrupted. Long enough for us to see what kind of people you are. The kind who work hard, who treat others with respect, who don't cause trouble. That's all we need to know. But the law out here is whatever we make it, Ruth said firmly. And we decide who belongs and who doesn't. Far as I'm concerned, you belong. Before Lydia could respond, there was a knock at the door. Ruth opened it to find Thomas standing on the porch, his expression grim. Ryder's back, he said without preamble. Brought 3 more men with him. They're at the general store asking questions, making threats. Ethan was on his feet immediately, but Ruth blocked his path. You go out there angry and armed, you'll just give them an excuse, she said. Let me handle this. Ruth, I said let me handle it, Ruth repeated, her voice brooking no argument. I've been in this settlement longer than anyone. They'll listen to me. She grabbed her shawl and headed for the door. Ethan hesitated only a moment before following, and Thomas fell into step beside him. Lydia wanted to go too, but Ruth turned and pointed a finger at her. You stay here with that baby, she commanded. Keep the door locked. Don't open it for anyone but us. Lydia wanted to argue, but saw the wisdom in staying hidden. She was what they were after all. Her presence would only escalate things. The men walked together to the general store where a small crowd had gathered. The 4 riders stood in the middle of the street, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold. The man Ethan recognized from Thomas's description was clearly in charge, well-dressed, well-armed, and carrying himself with the arrogance of someone used to getting his way. There he is, the man called out when he spotted Ethan. The mountain man who stole Samuel Garrett's property. I didn't steal anything, Ethan said evenly. I paid fair price for a woman nobody wanted. Oh, you can't buy a person, the man shot back. Not legally, which means you kidnapped her. That's a hanging offense. She came willingly, Ethan said. Ask her yourself. Oh, we will, the man said with a cold smile. Once we take her back to Crestfall where she belongs. Ruth stepped forward, placing herself between Ethan and the riders. You're not taking anyone anywhere. The man looked down at her with obvious disdain. Stay out of this, old woman. This is legal business. Legal business requires a lawman, Ruth said sharply, and the nearest lawman is 2 days' ride from here. So unless you've got a badge I don't see, you've got no authority in this settlement. We've got authority from Samuel Garrett. Samuel Garrett's got no authority here either, Ruth interrupted. This is a free settlement. We govern ourselves. And we've decided this woman and her child are under our protection. The man's expression darkened. You're harboring a criminal. We're protecting a new mother and her baby from men who want to drag her back to a place where she was sold like cattle, Ruth said, her voice rising so the entire crowd could hear. If that makes us criminals, then I guess we're all guilty. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ethan saw people he'd worked for over the past weeks, people who'd shared meals and stories, people who barely knew him but were willing to stand with him anyway. The blacksmith, the shopkeeper, the carpenter whose barn he'd repaired, even the preacher, a quiet man who rarely involved himself in conflict. The rider looked around and seemed to realize, for the first time, that he was outnumbered. His men shifted nervously, hands moving toward their guns. I wouldn't, Thomas said quietly, and Ethan saw that half the men in the crowd were armed. Not threatening, not aggressive, but present and ready. The rider's jaw tightened. Garrett's not going to like this. Then Garrett can come here himself and make his case, Ruth said. But he'll get the same answer. We don't hand over our people to men with more money than morals. The standoff lasted another tense minute. Then, Finally, the rider wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he said. "Garrett has connections. Lawyers, real law. You're just delaying the inevitable." "Maybe," Ruth said calmly. "But today, she stays here. And tomorrow. And every day after until proper law, not hired thugs, says different." The riders left, but their departure felt more like a retreat than a surrender. Ethan watched them go, his stomach tight with worry. Ruth was right that they'd won today, but the war was far from over. Back at Ruth's house, Lydia met them at the door with Anna in her arms. "What happened?" "They left," Ethan said. "For now." "The town stood with us," Ruth added, a note of pride in her voice. "Made it clear you're under our protection." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "Why would they do that? They don't even know me." "They know enough," Ruth said simply. "They know you're a mother trying to protect her child. They know Ethan's a good man who works hard and treats people with respect. That's all they need to know." But Ethan knew it wasn't enough. Garrett had money and influence, and men like that didn't give up just because one small settlement stood in their way. He'd come back with more men, or lawyers, or whatever it took to get what he wanted. They needed something more permanent, something legal and binding that would protect Lydia and Anna beyond the goodwill of their neighbors. That night, after Lydia had fallen asleep with Anna tucked beside her, Ethan sat at Ruth's kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee. Ruth joined him, her expression thoughtful. "You're thinking too loud," she observed. "Going to wake the baby." Ethan managed a faint smile. "How do we make this permanent? How do we stop Garrett from coming back?" "Marriage," Ruth said bluntly. Ethan looked up sharply. "What?" "You marry her," Ruth said. "Legal and proper. Once she's your wife, Garrett's got no claim. Can't say she was stolen or bought or coerced if she's standing beside you as your legal spouse." "I can't ask her to do that," Ethan protested. "She's been through enough. She doesn't need me pressuring her into—" "Who said anything about pressure?" Ruth interrupted. "I'm talking about giving her a choice, a real choice. Does she want to live her life looking over her shoulder, wondering when Garrett's going to come back? Or does she want to put down roots here, build a real future as your wife?" "She might not want that," Ethan said quietly. "Might not want me." Ruth snorted. "That girl looks at you like you hung the moon. Don't tell me you haven't noticed." Ethan had noticed. But noticing and believing were different things. He'd failed Sarah. What right did he have to ask another woman to trust him with her future? "Think about it," Ruth said, standing. "But don't think too long. Garrett's not going to wait forever." Ethan did think about it. For 2 days, he turned the idea over in his mind, examining it from every angle. Marriage to Lydia would solve the legal problem, yes, but it would also bind her to him permanently, and he wasn't sure he deserved that kind of trust. On the 3rd day, as he was working on repairs to the settlement's small schoolhouse, Lydia found him. Anna was strapped to her chest in a sling Ruth had made, sleeping peacefully against her mother's heart. "Can we talk?" Lydia asked. Ethan set down his tools and led her to a quiet spot behind the building where they could speak privately. "Ruth told me about her idea," Lydia said without preamble, "about marriage." Ethan's stomach clenched. "Lydia, you don't have to—" "I want to," Lydia interrupted. Ethan stared at her. "What?" "I want to marry you," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "Not because of Garrett, not because of the law. Because I love you," Ethan called her. "I've loved you since you gave me your bed and slept in the snow, since you stood between me and those men, since you held my hand through childbirth and cried when Anna was born." She took a step closer, looking up into his eyes. "You're the best man I've ever known," she said softly. "And I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you deserve to be happy, that you deserve a family, that what happened to Sarah wasn't your fault, and you don't have to punish yourself forever." Ethan's throat was so tight, he could barely breathe. "I don't have much to offer you. No land anymore, no house, just yourself," Lydia finished. "And that's everything I need." Ethan pulled her into his arms, careful not to crush Anna between them, and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, because she was. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "Yes, I'll marry you, if you're sure." "I've never been more sure of anything," Lydia said. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony in Ruth's front room. The entire settlement turned out to witness it, cramming into the small space until people were pressed shoulder to shoulder. Ruth stood as witness, holding Anna while the preacher spoke the words that bound Ethan and Lydia together as husband and wife. Ethan had found a simple gold band from the general store, and when he slipped it onto Lydia's finger, his hands shook. Lydia's hands were steady when she placed a matching band on his finger, bought with money she'd earned helping Ruth with difficult deliveries over the past weeks. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said with a warm smile. "You may kiss your bride." Ethan cupped Lydia's face gently and kissed her with a tenderness that made several women in the crowd sigh. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling through tears. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt. People brought food and drink, and someone produced a fiddle. There was music and laughter, and for a few hours the shadow of Garrett's threat seemed to lift. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, Ruth pulled Ethan aside. "I've got something for you," she said, pressing a folded document into his hands. "Marriage certificate, all legal and proper. I've already sent a copy to the territorial office. Nobody can say this marriage didn't happen." Ethan looked at the certificate, at his name and Lydia's written in careful script, and felt the weight of it settle around him like armor. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Ruth said. "We've still got to deal with Garrett." But when Garrett's men returned a week later, they found a very different situation than they'd expected. Lydia stood beside Ethan in front of the entire settlement, wearing her wedding ring and holding her daughter, and presented the marriage certificate to Garrett's lawyer, a sharp-faced man who'd ridden up from the territorial capital. "My client claims you were purchased illegally," the lawyer said, examining the certificate with obvious displeasure. "I was," Lydia said calmly, "by my mother, who sold me like property, but I chose to go with Ethan, chose to marry him, and now I'm his legal wife. Unless you're suggesting that married women can be bought and sold?" The lawyer's jaw tightened. "Of course not, but the circumstances are that I'm a free woman who made a free choice," Lydia said firmly. "And unless you've got a judge willing to say otherwise, I'm staying exactly where I am." The lawyer looked at Ethan. "You took advantage of a vulnerable woman. He saved a vulnerable woman," Lydia interrupted sharply. "He protected me when no one else would, fed me, sheltered me, defended me, and never once asked for anything in return. If that's taking advantage, then every man in this territory should be so guilty." The lawyer tried several more arguments, but each one fell apart under the simple truth. Lydia was legally married, legally protected, and had made her choice freely and publicly. There was no law he could invoke, no precedent he could cite, that would give Garrett what he wanted. Finally, he packed up his papers and prepared to leave. "Mr. Garrett won't be pleased," he said stiffly. "Then Mr. Garrett can learn to live with disappointment," Ruth said tartly. "Wouldn't be the worst thing that ever happened to him." The lawyer rode away, and this time he didn't come back. Weeks passed, then months. Spring came to the settlement, melting the snow and bringing new life to the valley. Ethan and Lydia, with help from their neighbors, began building a house on a piece of land the settlement had granted them, a wedding gift from people who barely knew them but had chosen to make them family anyway. The house grew slowly, one log at a time, one nail at a time. Ethan worked with steady determination, and Lydia helped where she could, little Anna strapped to her back or sleeping in a basket nearby. The settlement's children came to visit often, enchanted by the baby, and more than one young girl declared she wanted to be just like Anna when she grew up, loved and wanted and protected. One evening, as the sun set and painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan and Lydia stood together looking at the partially finished house. Anna slept peacefully in Lydia's arms, one tiny hand curled around her mother's finger. "It's going to be beautiful," Lydia said softly. "It's going to be home," Ethan corrected. Lydia leaned against his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, drawing her close. They stood like that for a long time, watching the light fade and the stars emerge. "Do you ever think about her?" Lydia asked quietly. "About Sarah?" "Every day," Ethan admitted. "But it's different now. Before, the memories hurt. Now they're just there. Part of who I was, but not all of who I am anymore." "She'd be happy for you," Lydia said. "For us." "I think so too," Ethan agreed. "She always said the worst thing about dying young was all the love you didn't get to give. I think she'd want me to give that love to someone who needed it. I needed it, Lydia whispered. I needed you. And I needed you, Ethan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Needed to know I could protect someone, could keep them safe, could be more than just a man haunted by failure. Anna stirred and made a small sound, and both parents looked down at her with identical expressions of wonder. She was growing so fast, changing every day. Her eyes had settled into a deep brown, and wispy dark hair had begun to grow on her head. She had Lydia's nose and mouth, but when she smiled, rare and precious as those early smiles were, Ethan swore he could see something of himself in the expression. What do you think she'll be like? Lydia mused. When she's older. Strong, Ethan said immediately. Like her mother. Kind, Lydia added. Like her father. And free, Ethan said. Free to choose her own path. Free to make her own mistakes. Free to love and be loved without shame or fear. Yes, Lydia agreed softly. Free. They stood there until full darkness fell and the night grew cold. Then they walked back to Ruth's house together, ready to rest before another day of building their future. The house was completed by midsummer. It wasn't large, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it was solid and well made, built to withstand harsh winters and whatever else life might throw at them. The settlement threw another celebration for the house raising, and Ethan and Lydia moved in surrounded by friends and neighbors who'd helped make it possible. That first night in their own home, Lydia stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, taking it all in. The sturdy walls Ethan had built, the hearth where they'd cook and stay warm, the window that looked out over the valley, the cradle beside the bed where Anna slept peacefully. This is ours, she said, wonder in her voice. Really ours. Really ours, Ethan confirmed, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Lydia turned in his embrace and looked up at him. A year ago, I was sold for 30 silver coins. I thought my life was over. Thought I'd never be anything more than property, passed from one cruel hand to another. And now? Ethan asked gently. Now I'm standing in my own home, with my husband's arms around me and my daughter sleeping safely nearby, and I understand something I never believed before. She reached up and touched his face. My life was never worthless. I just needed someone brave enough to see my worth when I couldn't see it myself. Ethan's eyes grew bright. You saved me too, you know. Saved me from living the rest of my life punishing myself for something I couldn't control. Gave me permission to hope again. We saved each other, Lydia said softly. That's what families do. From the cradle, Anna made a small sound, not distressed, just present, reminding them she was there. Ethan and Lydia both smiled. She's going to need a bigger cradle soon, Ethan observed. And eventually a bed of her own, Lydia added. And maybe someday siblings to share it with. Ethan looked at her with surprise and hope. You want more children? With you? Lydia said. Yes. When the time is right. When we're ready. I want this house full of life and laughter and love. Ethan kissed her then, deep and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. Over the following years, that promise was fulfilled. The house expanded as the family grew. 2 more children were born, a son they named Jacob after the old man who'd helped deliver Anna, and another daughter called Sarah, honoring the woman who'd shown Ethan what love could be. Anna grew into a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and showed early talent for working with her hands. Jacob was quieter, more thoughtful, with his father's steady determination. Little Sarah was still just a baby, but she had a laugh that could light up the darkest room. Ethan built furniture and helped neighbors with construction, while Lydia worked alongside Ruth, learning midwifery and helping bring new life into the settlement. Together they became pillars of the small community, people others turned to in times of trouble, people who proved through their actions that kindness and courage mattered more than blood or birthright. Margaret Harper died alone in Crestfall, her liver destroyed by years of drinking. The news reached the settlement through a traveling merchant, and Lydia felt nothing when she heard it. No grief, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure. The woman who'd given birth to her had made her choices, and Lydia had made hers. There was nothing more to say. Samuel Garrett lost most of his wealth in a bad business deal, and eventually left the territory entirely. His threats and lawyers and hired men all faded into memory, powerless against the simple truth of a family who'd chosen each other and refused to be separated. Thomas, the man who'd abandoned Lydia when she needed him most, passed through the settlement once, years later. He'd heard rumors of a woman matching her description and came looking, perhaps hoping to stake some claim to the child he'd fathered. He found Lydia in front of her house, surrounded by 3 children, with Ethan working nearby on a new addition to the structure. She was older, stronger, more confident than the frightened girl he'd seduced and abandoned. When she looked at him, there was no recognition in her eyes. He was just another stranger passing through. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He looked at the children, at the solid house, at the man who was clearly their father in every way that mattered, and he saw that there was no place for him here, no claim he could make that would stand against the life this woman had built. "No," he said quietly. "Wrong house. Sorry to bother you." He rode away and never came back. That evening, as Ethan tucked Anna into bed, she asked him a question she'd asked many times before. "Tell me again how you and Mama met." Ethan smiled and settled onto the edge of her bed. "Well, it was the coldest winter anyone could remember, and I rode down the mountain to a town called Crestfall." He told the story the way he always did, honestly but gently, explaining that sometimes people made mistakes, sometimes circumstances were cruel, but that love and courage could transform even the hardest situations into something beautiful. Anna listened with rapt attention, even though she'd heard the story dozens of times. When he finished, she asked her usual follow-up question. "And you saved Mama?" "We saved each other," Ethan corrected, just as he always did. "That's what families do." Anna nodded seriously, satisfied with this answer as always. Ethan kissed her forehead and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. He found Lydia on the porch, watching the sunset over the valley. She leaned back against him when he joined her, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "She asked about how we met again," Ethan said. Lydia smiled. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That we saved each other." "Good," Lydia said softly. "That's what I want her to remember. Not the ugliness we came from, but the beauty we built together." Below them, the settlement was settling in for the night. Smoke rose from chimneys, and lamplight glowed in windows. Children played in the last light of day, while parents called them home for supper. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary place, but to Ethan and Lydia, it was extraordinary. They'd taken the worst the world could offer, cruelty, abandonment, shame, violence, and transformed it into this: a home, a family, a future built on choice rather than circumstance, on love rather than transaction. "Do you ever regret it?" Lydia asked suddenly. "Taking that ride down to Crestfall? Paying those 30 coins? Ethan turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Never," he said firmly. "Those 30 coins bought me everything that matters. You, Anna, this life. I'd pay 1,000 times that amount without hesitation." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you," Ethan called her. "I love you too," Ethan said, pulling her close. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." From inside the house, they heard little Sarah crying and Jacob trying to soothe her with an off-key lullaby. Both parents smiled. "Duty calls," Lydia said. "Always," Ethan agreed. They went inside together, hand in hand, to tend to their children and continue building the life they'd fought so hard to create. The woman who'd been sold for 30 silver coins had become someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's friend. More importantly, she'd become someone who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone diminish it again. And the man who'd thought he was broken beyond repair had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about honoring it while building something new. Sarah would always be part of him, a first love that had taught him what it meant to care for another person. But Lydia had taught him that there was room in a heart for more than one great love, and that sometimes the most profound healing came from choosing to love again, despite the risk. Together, they'd proven that family wasn't just about blood or circumstance. It was about choice, about commitment, about showing up day after day and choosing each other even when things got hard. Years later, when Anna was grown and starting a family of her own, she asked her mother what the secret was to a lasting marriage. Lydia thought about it for a long moment before answering. Choose someone who sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself, she said finally, and then spend every day proving they were right to believe in you. Anna smiled and hugged her mother tight. Is that what Papa did for you? Yes, Lydia said softly, and what I did for him. We chose each other. We chose to build something beautiful out of something broken. And we chose to keep choosing each other every single day, no matter what came. It was, in the end, the simplest and most profound truth of their lives. That love wasn't something that just happened. It was something you chose, fought for, protected, and nurtured. It was showing up in the snow and the cold and the darkness, offering your hand to someone who'd been knocked down, and saying without words that they mattered, that they were worth saving, that they deserved a chance at happiness. Ethan Calder had offered that hand to a desperate young woman on the worst night of her life, and in accepting it, Lydia Harper had given him back something he'd thought lost forever. The belief that he could protect what he loved, that he could be trusted with another person's heart, that his life could still have meaning and purpose. They'd saved each other, just as Ethan always told their children, and in doing so, they'd created something that would endure long after they were gone. A family built on the radical premise that every person, no matter how broken or discarded, was worthy of love, dignity, and a chance to begin again. The woman once sold for 30 silver coins had learned her true value. And it was priceless. 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 And it was priceless.